Your Excellencies, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. I want to take this opportunity for a moment of reflection. Many of us were gathered in Le Bourget in Paris in 2015 when you, the parties, invited non-state actors into a dynamic partnership to drive forward climate action and created the role of high-level champion to guide this work. 6 years since the gavel came down, we have achieved something that was far from certain then. Non-state actors in the global economy have now reached consensus on the science and are actively working towards halving emissions this decade in order to be on track to keep temperature increases below 1.5 degrees. Working with my Chilean colleague Gonzalo Munoz and hundreds of Marrakesh partners, we have seen extraordinary momentum building under the Race to Zero. Today, representing nearly 8,000 organizations, over 5,000 businesses, 67 regions, over 1,000 cities, 400 financial institutions, and over 1,000 universities and 50 healthcare institutions, all committed to the short-term actions necessary to play their part in halving emissions this decade, all responding to the calls from citizens of the world, all in service of supporting parties in implementing the Paris Agreement. But of course, we're not where we need to be, as the latest IPCC and ND synthesis reports make clear. That's why we call it the Race to Zero. Indeed, to keep 1.5 degrees alive, we need to cut global emissions 5 times faster than we have over the last 10 years, which makes this the decisive decade, the decade to deliver on the promise of Paris and the prospect of a better, safer, fairer, healthier world for everyone. The scale of this task is vast, but what inspires confidence is that now we have clarity over what we have to do, and we are building the momentum to deliver it. Despite the global pandemic, we've seen this unprecedented ramp-up of momentum with more than 20% of the major businesses in 18 of 30 global sectors now in the Race to Zero. And these ambition breakthroughs point to the potential for 2030 outcome breakthroughs evidenced in the real economy, whether it's renewable energy growing faster and cheaper than any form of electricity in history, or world's car makers converging on phasing to 100% electric vehicles by 2035, or billions of investment in heavy industry, shipping, aviation, steel, cement, and green hydrogen for a net zero economy, all driven by an unprecedented pivot in the scale of commitment in private finance. Working with Mark Carney and the Glasgow Finance Alliance for Net Zero, the Race to Zero has now over $100 trillion of capital aligned with the climate science, with a particular focus on deploying in emerging markets. All this was unimaginable in Paris, much of it even 12 months ago. But now we can see the transition is technologically achievable, economically attractive, and it will deliver much greater prosperity all around the world than we have today. Working arm in arm with governments, the dynamism of the real economy, of businesses, investors, cities, states and regions, is demonstrating that all actors can step up their ambitious plans every single year. But this is not just an economic story. We also need a race to resilience. This is a human story touching all of us, the lives of our neighbours, our families and our children. So to explore these other dimensions, I'm honoured to welcome our next two speakers, Xiye Bastida, climate justice activist, and then C40 Cities Chair, Mayor Eric Garcetti. Xiye, over to you.
Honorable heads of state and present delegates, my name is Xiye Bastida, and I am a climate justice activist from Mexico. Firstly, as I speak, please keep in mind what you heard from my friend Elizabeth Withuti about opening our hearts. Today, I want to talk about the climate crisis being a generational injustice. When we talk about the impacts of the climate crisis on future generations, we speak on them as if those generations were not here, but we are present. By 2050, I will be 48 years old. And when I look out of the window, I will see the world you are negotiating right now. What will that Earth look like? If we were to stop emissions right now, we would leave the world with an increase of 1.1 degrees of warming, which is already causing immense damage in the form of floods, wildfires, hurricanes, biodiversity loss, forced migration, and more. In my home country, Mexico, there is an increase in the intensity of droughts and tropical storms, which are themselves exacerbating present injustices. And instead of trying to fix the damage prior generations have caused, we are adding to harm every day we fail to act, which represents a deep ethical immorality, an immorality of disconnect with the place we call home. Up to 475 million more people would be affected by climate-related risks if we get to 2 degrees of warming instead of 1.5. And even if we stay at 1.5 degrees, 4.5 billion people would be exposed to heat waves and water stress. This is my second conference of the parties. You have been doing this for longer than I've been alive. I have a simple question. How many more COPs are you going to have before we take action? We know exactly what needs to be done, and it starts by opening our hearts and our spirits. Here are some of the demands that youth have put together. We need to keep and reach the goal of 1.5 degrees by setting goals for drastic emissions reductions, starting with the richest countries. We need to collectively divest from fossil fuels and stop new fossil fuel infrastructure. According to the International Monetary Fund, governments gave up to $5.2 trillion to fossil fuel subsidies in 2019. We need to stop relying on carbon offsets as a way to counter emissions. We need to deliver the $100 billion promise to the most vulnerable nations, a number that should be 140 to 300 billion starting in 2025. We need to ensure a just transition to renewable energy in which workers' rights are upheld. Together, we must end the political, economic, and social influence of the fossil fuel industry in decision-making while holding them accountable for spreading climate misinformation. We must protect indigenous people's rights to care for their land, namely the 80% of biodiversity that is protected under their stewardship. I would like to invite everyone here to connect on a personal level to the following statement. I am in a critical moment in history in which I have a stake in the future of the planet. I will be respectful and responsible enough to listen to the generations of the future and to the best available science, and do everything in my power to leave this world better than I found it. Starting by committing to have my country do the most to stay below 1.5 degrees of warming while centering justice and the protection of frontline communities. Thank you. Before I leave, I would like to introduce Chair and C40 Cities Mayor of LA, Eric Garcetti. Thank you.
Gracias, Xiye, por la introducción. Good evening, everyone, and thank you to the United Nations, to our hosts, the United Kingdom and Italy, and every leader who is here in Glasgow. I'm Eric Garcetti, the chair of C40 Cities and mayor of Los Angeles. And this is the speech you've been waiting for, the final speech of the day. But I come not just as the last speaker, but with a message that I hope inspires you. Because at a time of immense worry, I come here with a message of intense hope. The unified voice of the world's cities who say that we can, we must, and we will deliver. In 2019, my peers elected me to chair C40, a global network of mayors who committed then to making the 2020s the climate decade, a decade of action. 2 years later, it's very clear that this needs to be a decade of exponential action. But cities are leading the way to save our planet, to invest in our people, and to leave no one behind. And we are testament to 3 facts. 1, that we are on the front lines. It is our residents who are fleeing fires, our residents who are fleeing floods, grappling with drought and heat. 2, we know how to fix it. Cities aren't just laboratories of progress. We are the factories of the future, transforming how we heat and cool our buildings, move around our cities, and generate our electricity. And third, we are getting it done. 2/3 of C40 cities have set and met targets that meet or exceed the Paris commitments on time or early. You see, we can inspire national climate action and ambition to show what's possible. If you don't think you can have fully electric bus fleet, go to Shenzhen and see it. Or clean up your central district in an ultra-low emission zone, go to London and experience it. And if you don't think that a city is on its way to 100% renewable power, I invite you to Los Angeles, where we will be 97% carbon-free by the end of this decade. This progress is meaningful, but let's be honest, at the end of this day, it is still not enough, which is why we launched the Cities Race to Zero, a partnership of C40, CDP, Global Covenant of Mayors, ICLEI, UCLG, WWF, and the World Resources Institute. And tonight, my friends, I am proud to announce the biggest pledge at COP outside of our national commitments, that Cities Race to Zero has produced a global coalition of over 1,000 cities and local governments, representing 722 million people, more than a quarter of the world's GDP, committed to reaching net zero emissions by 2050 and cutting their fair share, our fair share of global emissions, in half by 2030. And the UN says that our collective action has the potential to reduce global emissions by at least 1.4 gigatons by 2030 annually. That's like taking a country bigger than the 5th country and cutting out our emissions altogether. From Kinshasa to Heidelberg, Salvador to Osaka, cities are keeping 1.5 degrees alive. In conclusion, our people are counting on us. Our world needs hope. The future of our planet depends on us. So let's summon the courage to make this the decade of exponential action and implementing a global Green New Deal. The poet Robert Browning said, "Our reach must always exceed our grasp. After all, what's a heaven for?" And my friends at the COP, I would say our reach must exceed our grasp. After all, what is this COP for? Distinguished delegates, excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, this concludes our interlude. Thank you and have a good evening.